Forwards. Back.
It's hard, eh?
Nice.
In person. For me, first time in like 4 years.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting in 1 minute. Thank you. Digitalizing Results Management. Well, that's great.
Great.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for settling in. You are in the right place if you are here for Digitalizing Results Management. And it is a really opportune time because if you read the program, you see that it starts with recent research suggests that public managers do not consistently use performance information. I think that is just what we heard from that excellent presentation from Bonnie Lissick. So this one is for you, and this is, again, this is also about the future. So you're going to hear some things that we think are really important going forward. You won't hear it from me. I'm simply here to facilitate. You will hear it from Dr. Greg Richards, Vice Dean, Graduate Professional Development Programs, Telfer School of Management, University of Ottawa. There's an extensive bio on Dr. Richards in here, but what's really cool is that he's been a previous PPX board member. He's made significant contributions to this field in many, many ways beyond the graduate school leadership. But he's been exploring the use of data mining, data management, and artificial intelligence linked to certain key elements of results-based management. And so I won't read through this whole bio, but allow people to do so. To give you more time, sir, to provide us with some excellent information and hopefully some stimulating thoughts for you to please ask some questions about when we're done. Without further ado, over to you, Greg.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Ça me fait un très grand plaisir d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. It's a topic that I like to talk about. So a number of years ago, I read a book by Gary Hamel. Gary Hamel is one of these management guru types from Harvard. And he started off by saying something like, organizations have evolved, but management practices have not. His argument was we're still managing the way we managed 150 years ago, despite all of the new technology. So that kind of started my interest in researching what I called at the time management process innovation. And it's interesting because I usually do case studies, and the first organization I talked to, when I used that term, I got a really blank look. It's like, what do you mean by management process innovation? So the research has continued over the years. We have done surveys of over 1,000 organizations. We're up to about 15 case studies. And what we're trying to understand is, broadly speaking, when you introduce new technology into an organization, whatever it is, there's an impact on the human system, right? And so what we're trying to understand is the technical elements of how we use analytics to inform results management, but we're also interested in the human impact, the human element of that. So what I do at the university, as Steve mentioned, I wear two hats. I have all these programs, graduate professional programs, so the MBA, the executive MBA, and so on. The research group is mostly a collection of applied researchers. And what we're interested in is trying to create outcomes, models, frameworks, tools that really make a difference for people who are trying to manage performance in organizations. So what I'll chat with you about are some case studies, and use the case studies to highlight some things I think it'll work moving forward. As we go through, you'll see some slides that have some obvious questions. So if you want to make a note of those, I prefer to do interactive sessions, but the way we're set up, I don't think we can do that. So if you just make a note of some of those kind of question slides, and we can chat about it after. I'll probably chat for about 30, 35 minutes and leave some time for us to talk, okay? So this slide, bit of an overview. Key themes, so three of them, right? One is, I think most of you are familiar with logic models. And so what we have learned is that you can use the logic model as what we're calling a data storyboard. So I'll talk about that with reference to the cases in a few minutes. The second point is this notion of analytics strategies. So strategy is a way of getting something done, right? And an analytics strategy is a way of using analytic tools to inform results-based management. And then the third point speaks to the human issue. I've been in a lot of organizations. There's a lot of excitement, all right? We're chasing all sorts of shiny things. We've got generative AI now and all sorts of things we can do with it. And it's fun. But the question is the human system organized to change based on the results of your analytic strategy? Because if it's not, then what we end up doing is we gather data to report, although as Bonnie just pointed out, there's maybe not a lot of great reporting going on. There's a lot of data gathering going on. If the system isn't designed to be changeable, then it's an interesting exercise, but we don't get what we want. What we want is we want to use data to improve program results. And if you're not ready to change, then that's probably not going to happen. I mean, we can change continuously, obviously, but we have to think about how to at least change continually. So those are sort of the three key themes, right? How do we get the right data? We're inundated with data, both structured and unstructured. About 80% is unstructured, so that's documents, right? Or semi-structured, because documents tend to have headings and titles and so on and so forth. So it's more semi-structured than completely unstructured. But now we're also dealing with video and sound and images. And so those tend to be highly unstructured forms of data. In all that, how do we focus on the right data bits? And so that's how you use your logic model to guide you to the data that you need. And almost every day, there's a new tool or a new algorithm that emerges. How do you choose which ones make sense, in order to manage results? So those are some of the things we'll chat about as we go through. All right. We've been doing this for over 60 years, at least in Canada. I think it's probably more like 100 years around the world. I don't know, so what have we learned after 60 years of results management? So this is one of those slides where you can make a little note, and I'd love to hear from you in terms of what you think we've learned after 60 years of results-based management. I'll give you a couple of thoughts. One is we have an alphabet soup, right? If you go back just in Canada, all of the different frameworks and tools and models focused on results-based management is a veritable alphabet soup. And my impression is that what we do is we create a new acronym, but what happens underneath doesn't change that much. It's just we call it something else, which is fine. If it makes sense to the people who are doing this, it's all good. But the fundamentals don't really change. So that's one. The second thing we might have learned is that in operational departments, it's sometimes easy to measure things, right? Bonnie mentioned birth certificates and things like that. So you're generating licenses and passports, and you can count those things, easy to measure. Whether or not it's the right thing to measure is the question. Because it's easy, do we measure it? And because it's hard, we don't measure it. So those are issues that we have to think about. In your typical logic model, on the left side of the model, which is usually inputs and activities, we can count those. The right side, the outcome side, becomes very challenging, right? So we've learned those things. One of the other things we've learned is that we love complexity. The more complex your logic model is, the more impressive it is. We love complexity. Never mind that now you've got 153 different indicators to measure, and we actually don't know what to do with them, but we can measure them. Complexity is a thing that we tend to drift to. What I'm going to talk to you about is how do you simplify that and get to the data points that really matter to help you drive forward in improving program results. All right?
Sounds good. Do you have a favorite acronym over the years for these?
No.
I do. I
Do you?
do.
What's yours, Steve?
Mine was the PPBS, which was way back in the 70s.
Yeah.
And so for those who have a mind of a 12-year-old, it turned out to be a lot of PP and BS.
Program planning and budgeting system. I remember it well. Yeah. So we throw them out there, but I think fundamentally the logic doesn't change at the bottom. Okay. So let me tell you about what the research says. Item 1, this is what's called a meta-analysis. So 49 studies that looked at all sorts of different organizations. And the finding was there's a lot of performance information floating around departments, but it has very little impact on performance. 2 reasons for it. So there's a statistical approach called the effect size. And so in this case, it was very low. It was like 0.16 or something. So it means that there's not a lot of impact of performance information. 2 reasons for it. First is we tend to use it for reporting, which is okay. We have to report to somebody about something. So we use it for reporting. But the other piece is there's an incredible resistance to things changing. And I don't think it's really about human volition so much. I think it's just we have large systems in place, which are a combination of technology and people and processes and systems, and there's just an incredible inertia if we want to make things change, right? Some slightly better news. What the researchers have found out is that the impact of performance information tends to improve if it's integrated into a management system of some kind. So what does that mean? Most departments, we have planning in one group, we have performance measurement in another group, and we have auditing in a third group. And so the notion is we have atomized all of the pieces that we need in order to manage results. And so if that's integrated into some kind of a management system, it works. We did one case study with a Crown Corporation here. And what they did was they took all these 3 groups and they put them into one group called Planning and Performance Management, just like PPX. So they had better results because people were actually talking to each other about what are the outcomes you care about, how would we measure them, and then when you did your audit, your 5-year audit, what kind of the key things we would look for. So there was a regular dialogue about how all of these things work. So that's an integrated results management system that worked well for that Crown Corp. It may not work well for everybody, but at least there needs to be some communication, right? This one, back to bad news. The impact is constrained by goal ambiguity and high levels of bureaucracy. Does that sound like your department? I worked at Transport Canada early in my career. I love the department, because it was what I call an active thing. I was out on ships and boats and planes and all that fun stuff. I worked with emergency response crews. And one of the most difficult things we had to do, we had to build a performance measurement framework for emergency response crews. Imagine this. What you want is for nothing to happen, right? And so we do a lot of prevention work and nothing ever happens, so what on earth do we end up measuring? And then you ask yourself the question, if there's nothing happening, how would I improve performance over nothing? I did a project with the Canadian Nuclear Commission. Same idea. We don't want nuclear disasters to happen, right? So it becomes very difficult if you start to think about this notion of goal ambiguity. What do we really want? And if that's not clear, it's hard to build performance measures and it's hard to use data to drive program results. And then the last point, some more hopeful news, right? The hopeful news is that more what was referred to as sophisticated performance information can help drive impact. And by sophisticated, what they mean is getting beyond raw data. So when we report out, what we do is we tend to report out on what's going on, so what's happening at the moment. What they were talking about is, well, look, if you gave a program manager a dashboard, and we're good at creating dashboards, you give a program manager a dashboard, and they kind of look at the data and go, okay, yeah, that's good. What's next? I did a project with an operational department here in Ottawa. They had regions all over Canada, and they built a beautiful dashboard, right? They had targets and metrics, they had color codes and green and yellow and red and all this fun stuff. And they had a great conversation about what it looked like. Then one regional director, I think he was from Toronto, he says, this all looks great. What am I supposed to do with this information? And this was in the days of teleconferencing. Right now we have Teams and Zoom and WebEx and all that stuff. So nobody could see anybody's face. We were just online. But there was silence for about 3 minutes as everybody said, that's a really good question. So this one says, if we have information that moves beyond the raw data, managers can start to do something with it in terms of improving performance. Okay, so that's kind of where the research is at this point in time related to a lot of this. The terminology being used is performance information as opposed to KPIs. And I think that's because we're now dealing with a lot of non-quantitative data. So if you think about your outcomes, for example, in a lot of situations, you don't have a number, you probably have a dialogue that talks about what is the impact you're having if you're collecting data from service recipients or whoever it is. So it's very difficult at this point in time to say it's just one quantitative number, that's not one thing I'm looking for. So that's why they use the term performance information as opposed to KPIs. Okay, so the case studies. So the what we've learned on this slide is kind of a high level, and I'll get into more details. You'll see lessons learned on a bunch of slides as I go through it. So 4 organizations, large public sector, large private sector, 2 not-for-profits. What I'll talk about today is the large public sector and the large private sector one. Okay? What we learned. The problems are similar. So I think there's a perception that the private sector does this stuff better. They do some things differently. Let me put it to you that way. What I saw in the private sector organization is that there's an accountability proxy in it. So when we talk about bottom line results, if we don't meet a certain sales volume, we have to cut staff and so on and so forth. So there's this accountability thing that's there. In the public sector, it's not quite the same, but we can have a proxy for accountability in some way in the private sector. So the problems are not as different as we think they are between the 2 sectors. And you'll see some differences as I go through the case study. It's early days for everyone when it comes to using all of the new tools. And by the new tools, I mean, everybody's interested in AI and now generative AI and all that fun stuff. It's early days for everyone. And none of the organizations we've talked to so far have crafted a coherent, what I'm calling, analytics strategy. And by that, what I mean is, if you think about your program and the outcomes that you want, and then the data that you need to collect, and then what you do with the data, and then who looks at it, and then what decision rights do they have. So you need all those things in place so that when you get the output, it's a trigger to action, right? So we'll talk through some of that as we go through. Bonnie talked about Ontario, but we did a case study with one organization in the Ontario government. And they went through this. It was a few years ago, so AI wasn't a thing, but they're using analytics. And I asked them, so how do you trigger action? After you do all of this work, how do you trigger action? And the answer was interesting because one of the things they said is that there is a certain level of distrust that permeates a lot of these organizations. If you think about unions on one side and management on the other side, and then all of the regional offices that have to work together, there's a slight level of distrust. So what they would do is they would have their analytic models and the processes they use audited by a third party. And a third party could be a think tank or a university or something like that. They would have them audit it, so to speak, and then write a little summary that says, yes, right data, treated the right way, the results seem reliable, and so on and so forth. And he said, well, we use that to help prepare the organization for change. So we're trying to decrease the level of distrust by saying nobody is out to get anybody, right? So some things to think about. How do you trigger change? Right. Okay, case study 1. A large public sector organization. I've disguised as much as I can so that we don't implicate the innocent in this. You can see the logic model. Extreme right side, like many of these organizations, it's about driving innovation and economic growth, some way, shape, or form. Middle, so these are your outputs, publications, patents, right? Because patents signal new business formation. Publications signify some way of innovating, right? And then what's referred to as highly qualified personnel. These are students or junior researchers who may be working with the research team, and they build their skills in doing research and driving patent applications and things of that nature. On the left side are the inputs. And the inputs, in this case, they give out money. So many of you probably work with G&C programs. Similar idea. They give money out to third-party groups to do the research, to drive the publications, to drive the outcome that they want, right? So some lessons learned. They had a very well-defined logic model. It was simple, straightforward, and very easy to understand what they were trying to do. So we used the logic model as a data storyboard. The question is, what data do we need to better understand the impact that we're having? So the language of the senior leaders we were talking to was, you know, we're probably putting out $500 million a year. What are we getting for it? Important question, right? So what data do we need to collect? Second point is that the data needed on the right side, well, even starting from outputs, actually, it wasn't there, right? As we started to build this out, the question is, how do we know? And the answer was, well, we're not collecting that data. And I'll show you in a bit that we actually went out. I had a group of students working with us, and we went out and captured data from the patent offices, both here and in the States, and the Web of Science to look for publications, and we had to kind of match those things together, right? So the logic model was a great storyboard. It said, here are the data we need. And then the question is, where is it? And the answer is, it's not available, okay? So then the next step is we have to go get it. And then the last point, the analytics strategy. The question that was asked was, on the left side, I'm putting all of these things into the market, and on the right side, what am I getting? That was the question in terms of the notion of the analytic strategies. I'm trying to figure out what's linked to what, but the data strategy didn't really match that particular aspect of it, right? This is the private sector organization. So on the right side, they're trying to drive sales volume, what a lot of private sector organizations want to do. In the middle, they wanted to drive traffic at hundreds and hundreds of retailers across the country. Then on the left side, the question was, they had over 400 different products. We're going to discount some of these products to see if that's going to drive traffic, which is going to drive sales volume. So that's kind of what the story was. Same thing, logic model tells a data story, no problem. Very clear, very concise. They had a well-designed data infrastructure. So the databases were well-structured. They had a business intelligence framework on top of their operational data stores. And so we were able to extract data quite nicely. Here's the problem. If you're familiar with business intelligence, you know that the data are highly summarized when they come off of the BI system. But if we're going to do analytics, we do need the raw data. And so we had to go back into the operational system to capture the raw data. So that was one problem. The second problem was a little bit more interesting. So when we got to the raw data, there was about 5 million rows. So that's a lot of data. The thing they wanted to figure out was, does discounting drive sales volume, right? So left side to right side, same idea. The problem is, in that huge data set, there was no field called discounted price. And so we spent a pile of time looking at two fields, list and selling, and trying to figure out whether or not that told us what a discounted price was. And so you see what I mean by similar problems, slightly different. One, we didn't have data, so sparse data problem. Two, we had lots of data, we just didn't have the data point we needed to answer the question that was being asked. So this is very common. The not-for-profits we work with, very similar idea. Easy to ask the questions, right? Is what I'm doing driving the results I want? Easy question to ask. do you have the data to answer, number one? And number two, are the data in the form that we can use in the analytic tools? So those are the issues we ran into. All right. So what we did for the public sector, this shows the patents. And so we had to build this data model. We use a SQL database, built the data model, brought the data in from the left side of the logic model, so inputs, which is who's receiving funds, when they received them, how much they received, all that stuff. We had 10 years of data. Here's the interesting thing. It's all public data. There was nothing that we took off of the organization's database systems that was considered proprietary. Everything was public data. It was all out in the public domain. So we captured all of that. And then the students went into the Web of Science. Well, in this slide, they did the CIPO office here and then the one in the States, and asked the question, are we seeing any patterns? The thing we had to do where the red boxes are is we had to figure out how to align the patterns that were being created and the publications that were being created to the groups that were being funded, because there was no obvious link, right? And that is a very common problem. No matter what organization I've been in, private sector, large, small, public sector, large, small, very common problem. I don't have a link in order to ask the question, does this thing relate to that thing? So that's what we had to do with the private sector. Public sector, sorry. With the private sector, once we figured out the data fields that were needed, then this is the process we went through. We ran through a number of different algorithms. So LSTM, long short-term memory, that's a recurrent neural network. If those terms mean nothing to you, it's all good, don't worry about it. It's just a way of treating data. And some of you who are in the field might know that LSTM is one of the foundations of generative AI. So if you're looking at these types of models, you can read up on that. It's quite interesting how all that evolved. Support vector machines is a classification kind of tool. We ended up with the one on the bottom, random forest. So what that is, it's a bunch of decision trees. And then what the algorithm does, it'll combine and choose the best tree out of the random forest. That's why it's called the random forest. Here's the interesting thing. So the top two, LSTM and support vector machines, managers didn't really get it. Like we showed it to them. It's like, I don't understand what this means. Imagine that you're making a decision based on output of an algorithm, and somebody asks you to explain it, and you say, I don't know. You don't get to blame the algorithm, right? It's still your decision. And so what we learned was really important, that there are hundreds of these types of tools available. It's important to choose ones that the decision maker can explain, because somebody has to explain why you made this decision. And you don't get to say, hey, the algorithm said I should do this, so I did it, right? So that's the thing we really learned, is that let's focus on output that a manager can explain if he or she is going to make a decision to change something. So that became really important. The other lesson we learned in this particular, well, in both actually, is that when you have the business users, the decision makers in the development process, it makes a huge difference. So in both of them, each project took, well, the private sector one was longer because they were more complicated, but the public sector was about an 8-month process, and the private sector was probably closer to 13, 14 months. And all along the way, we brought the decision makers with us. And yes, when we showed them some of the output, they didn't get it. We explained as best we could. But then our logic was, instead of using things they don't understand that we have to explain, why don't we use things that's easier for them to understand so they can explain it? So that's where this notion of using decision trees came out. It's visual. It's a visual representation of the relationship between things. So they can put up a chart and say, listen, we did a discount here, we saw traffic improve here, and there's the links between them. They can do the explanation. The data scientists don't have to do it. That was a huge turning point for us in understanding how to use data better to drive results, right? Decision makers have to understand it, have to be able to explain it to other people. The analytics strategy. So, I mean, a couple of things here, right? It does depend on the type and the amount of data. And so we've built a course around this for the for the graduate students, because we'd like them to go out using data to drive performance. And it's always interesting when we talk about data types. It's like, what do you mean by data type? Well, there are all sorts of data types, right? Different levels of measurement is what I mean. So if you have a certain type of data, you can run sophisticated analyses on it. But let's say you have a data that says, well, coming into the organization, we're serving X number of females, X number of males. You can't do averages on, male, female, right? You can't do averages on regions. And so part of the understanding for the management teams that we work with is when you build your analytic strategy, you look at your logic model. The logic model defines the data points. What types of data are you talking about? And if you're talking about heavily unstructured data, you have to use different tools. We're just working on a project now where we're using one of the analytic tools to look at text data, so text mining. The field has advanced tremendously, but it's still not understandable to a lot of people, right? So now we're trying to figure out how do we get semi-structured data into the mix. So normally what we do, we use the logic model, we identify the data, we say, okay, these are the data types that are linked to your logic model, and here's what we think we can do with it. So that's the important point. Depends on the ability of humans to interpret the output. So that's the point I had made about the random forest approach. If we show you a bunch of things and you're kind of going, eh, once we showed them the decision tree, it's like, okay, I get this, right? And they started talking about what they have seen in their organization in terms of saying, every time I do this, this happens, and so on. So it became an exciting conversation as opposed to one that kind of went, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? Should lead to change. So how do you build a changeable organization? One step, as I mentioned, is make sure that the decision makers are engaged as early as possible in the development of the entire process, right from the logic model. Now, what we've done in most cases is logic models are the purview of the evaluation team in a lot of situations. I have encouraged, and students going through the program, I've encouraged them to use them as management tools. Because if somebody is presenting to you, I want to do this project, easy to ask them, what outcomes are you expecting? What are you planning to do? And how much do you need? Right? And so there are a couple of them who've graduated. They've used it almost every time they have something to do in the organizations. It works extremely well. Right? So the question here is, when you build a changeable organization and you include the decision makers right at the beginning, they'll know when change is needed, and it tends to trigger change a lot more easily. I'll show you on one of the last slides as well, this notion of using data-driven scenario modeling, which helps to reduce a little bit of the uncertainty and change. Because that's one of the things that we run into with change management, right? There's risk, and there's a bit of fear of the unknown. What's likely to happen if I do this? But the scenario modeling approach really helps take that away. So on the bottom, fundamental analytic strategy. Describe. So you can't avoid describing. That's what the nodes in your logic model are about. So the blue boxes that you saw, so that's what's happening, how much money do I have, what kind of activities am I doing, what kind of outputs am I delivering, and if you have data on outcomes, you can talk about outcomes. Most organizations I've been in do not have data on outcomes, right? So, but the nodes described, the arrows in between the nodes, that's the second point there, association modeling. So I call it association modeling because there are two elements related to it. One is to explain, and the second is to predict, right? So we use the general term association modeling because it's not always about prediction. Sometimes it's about explaining. And I'll show you an example of that as we move forward. And then the last piece, the what-if scenarios, and I'll show you this example as well. To me, that's the most action-oriented component of the analytic strategy. So I can describe all the things using the nodes on your logic model. Then the arrows ask the question, what kind of association models do I need to build? For example, you have X number of dollars for your budget. Does that allow you to do all the activities you think you're going to do? And are those activities aligned to the outcomes that you care about? So the arrows are indications of association modeling. Why is that? Well, when you build your logic model, you build your theory of change, you create a series of propositions, right? And the propositions go something like this. If I had X number of dollars, I'll hire X number of people to do these activities, which would lead to these outcomes. Those are a series of propositions. The data that you have allow you to test whether or not those propositions are true. And so when I work with students, I tell them, look, every business plan is a series of propositions. They're educated guesses, but in a lot of cases, they are guesses. We're just not sure that the thing I say I'm going to do on the left is going to lead to the things I want on the right. You can use the data to test whether those propositions are actually true or not. So that's the notion of an analytics strategy. I know I have to describe. I use the nodes in the logic model for the data that will describe things. The arrows are the things I use to ask the question, is one thing related to the other? Are my propositions holding true in the face of the data that I'm collecting? Oh, by the way, none of the organizations that we have been in are at this point. Okay, so this is sort of an aspirational kind of thing that we're trying to get to.
Future.
The future. Yeah, we're in future fit, so that's the thing. So a couple of examples. This is the case study one, the large public sector organization, right? So these are just numbers of projects. And on the left side, you can see the number of projects, and on the bottom, you have years. So very simple stuff, right? Input box. We had a lot of data on the input boxes because we had 10 years of data. So there's a lot of information there. It wasn't all that exciting for anybody. It was sort of a head nod. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. That was about it. So you see what I mean by more sophisticated forms of analytics? If you just get a head nod, it's like, okay, fine. What you want is you want somebody leaning in to kind of go, oh, that looks interesting, and I don't know why that. So that's the kind of discussion that you really want to have happen. Association modeling. Here's an interesting thing. So there are a couple elements to the slide I'll explain as we go through. What you're looking at is the back testing. So normally when you do an analytics project, you have a large data set, you separate it into two. You use one set to train the model, right? And then you use the second set to test it. So this is the first piece of the model where we're training. And what we wanted to find out is, could we, based on a stated number of publications, for example, could we predict the budget that's needed? Now, budgeting is a thing in most organizations, and what you do is either you go from last year's with an increment. Very few organizations have been into zero-based budgeting, right? But this is an example that says, well, let's not do incremental budgeting. Let's ask the question, what do we want, and work backwards to the budget that we need. So this gave us about 85% predictive accuracy. And what we're saying to the managers is, look, if next year the idea is that you want to double or triple the number of publications, you can use this as a rationale for going back to the budget that you're going to need, all right? Because the data does provide you enough assurance, 85% accuracy, gives you enough assurance that if you want to augment the number of things you want to do, you're going to need a bigger budget. We've all heard about departments cutting numbers. I'm willing to bet that in that slashing and burning, there's no consideration of the deliverables that you have related to the budget you currently have now, all right? I mean, there's some work that's being done in figuring out, if I have to cut this, then I have to give up something. But usually, at the governmental level, that calculus doesn't happen all that much. So what we wanted to do here was just give them an idea that, look, as things move and you want to do more of this or less of that, it has an impact on the budget that you're going to need. So the what-if modeling. Hard for you to see, but I wanted to show you what the software produced. This is a software tool called RapidMiner. It's one of the more intuitive ones. If you're using R or Python, those are command line types of tools. This one is more GUI driven. And so what it does, what you're looking at is on the left side, location. So that's the location that the grant was given, because this organization gave grants to the entire country. So location one might be Saskatchewan, for example, right? The small numbers that you can't read, that's the amount of grant that was given. The big number that you can read is the number of publications. So on the left, 31. And then on the right side, what we did was kept the location constant, but doubled the budget. And so the predictive model says, well, if you stayed in location 1 and doubled the budget, you'll get an extra 2 publications, right? So law of diminishing returns, right? I give you more money and you deliver a little bit more, but not as much as if I'd given you more money at the beginning. This got that reaction, this leaning in, asking the question, well, suppose we vary location. So we could vary location by any of the ones that we had in the data set. We can go from Quebec to BC, and varying location, you saw different numbers. Suppose we halved the budget, what would happen? Suppose we tripled the budget, that would happen. So this kind of if-then thinking got people around the table really asking the question. You know? And the other question that came up, how come I double the budget, I only get 2 more? If I'm getting 31 at $113,000, shouldn't I get 60 when I double the budget? Well, the answer is no. Why? Because you're limited in what any human system can do, no matter how much money they have, right? There's only so many students available. There's only so much time available. So that's the kind of thinking that helps us think about how to get more out of the current resource pool that we have. So what if scenario, all right? Okay, so last slide. Bit of a summary. So logic models, we use them for all sorts of stuff. I've seen a lot of them. Many of them are extremely complex. The question is, can you simplify them to the point that you could use them as your data storyboard? The nodes will tell you what kind of data you need for description, what's happening. The arrows indicate the association models that you need to build. When you select association models, it's important to understand what you're trying to do, right? So we went backwards. We went from output to input for this particular organization because it made sense. It may not make sense for every organization, right? So that's the first point. Logic models is data storyboard. Analytic strategy, descriptive plus association modeling. And by the way, you don't have to use sophisticated AI tools for association modeling, right? In the health field, for example, they use simple things like relative frequency and odds ratios and things like that. And these are back of the napkin types of calculations you can do. So it's not hard to do. Across your logic model, you may have to use different tools, right? So depending on the type of data you have, you might have to use different tools at different stages in your logic model. But all of them will start to drive that discussion that you want, which is, if I did this differently, would I get a different result, right? That'll take you to your scenario modeling. Once you have your association models figured out, that takes you to the scenario models, because your scenario modeling is based on your association model. And now you get people around the table asking the question, suppose we did this, suppose we did that, right? Data should be in good form. So, I said 8 months for one and 13 for, it's a lot of work. It just really is, especially if you're preparing the data. If you have data that's ready to go and clean and all that, it's going to go a lot faster. So be patient. It does, to me, the most interesting thing is once we get to a point where the decision makers kind of start to lean in around the table and ask really hard questions about why they're doing things the way they're doing, that's the goal. That's where we want to get to. If we just kind of go, let's write this report and send it off to somebody, not very interesting, right? So that's where you want to get to. So consistent with the logic model, data should be in good form, consistent with the association approaches that you're using. And then finally, changeability. So it should be a learning tool, right? And as you sit around the table and ask yourself the question, how do we use this to make a difference? You have to think about your own management process. So do you have, regular meetings where you're looking at data? Should you look at it every month, every 3 months, every 6 months? I don't know. Each organization has a different rhythm. And so you have to kind of think through that whole process. My suggestion is, if you're going to launch a project that looks like this to use analytics better, right, to drive results management, then think about the end when you start at the beginning. Because you don't want to get halfway through and then you say, oh my God, I'm going to run into all this resistance if things are going to change. Start at the front. That's why we brought the business decision makers in right at the very front, because we wanted them on this journey to get to the point where they say, okay, I've got all this data, what do I do with it, right? That was the big question that we heard. So I'll leave you one last point, and then if there's some questions, happy to chat. You know, with digitalization in general, you can digitalize at 4 points in the organization, right? Information layer, a lot of data fusion type projects happening, so that can happen. The stakeholder engagement, so that's the front end where you might be using internet-enabled types of interaction tools. The operations layer, so that's the source, make, and deliver. And then the management layer, and that's where we get into digitalizing results management, that management layer that says, if I can get you better information, you can make better decisions about how to improve the results that you've been asked to deliver. Okay, so I'll stop there, and if there are any questions, happy to tackle.
Greg, that was great, and I'm going to take advantage of being up here with the mic to ask you a first question.
Sure.
I'm hearing you say it's a sort of a not-so-random forest if you use a logic model, maybe as a sort of equivalent,
Yeah.
i.e. an understandable thing. As everyone here who's taken our RBM courses knows, we focus on the result logic as a really key thing.
Yeah.
You and I work together on codifying some of that logic model we like, which is a little more parsed version, you know, in terms of
Yep.
the early outcomes, engagement, reaction, and so on. I really also love that you had arrows. You talked about the arrows between and how that's the real theory that's going on as to why you get there.
Yep.
As people may know, the government of Canada is now asking people not just to have a result logic, but also to talk about the assumptions and factors that make it work. And therefore, the placement of those assumptions and factors logically should go with the arrows. I'm drawing in the air for assuming people know what a logic model is.
Yep.
That is a level of complexity that's a little more than simple, but it strikes me as being really, really important. And I wonder if you see that as well. Like, for example, you said about the doubling of the budget doesn't end up with doubling publications because there's a constraint on capacity, as I would see it, which is a factor that influences that arrow, if you know what I'm saying.
Yep.
Would you see that as the future? I mean, in other words, the future of logic models that include these assumptions and factors could be used to that effect. Would
Yep.
that be fair?
Yeah, I think so. And I've put it back on the screen here, the public sector one, because quite right. And that's the advantage of having the decision makers involved at the beginning, because we test all of those things,
Yeah.
right? And where you see that doubling of budget with just 2 more, we had a great conversation about that. Why does that happen? And managers, they often know what's actually going on. They know what's happening at the front line. So we can design a logic model that looks pretty and has all sorts of stuff to it, but when you talk to the management, they have a pretty good idea of this is not going to work, and let me tell you why. So that's really the importance is, yes, all of those arrows define your series of propositions and assumptions and all that fun stuff. We get to test them. In our geeky research world, we make a distinction between propositions and hypotheses, right?
Yeah.
So proposition is in words. If I do this, this will happen. A hypothesis is in data. I now have the data to test whether X relates to Y. We don't have that conversation with managers because they think we're being, super geeky. But, but that's the message: is we know there are propositions built into your logic model. We can find the data to test them, and that makes a difference because sometimes what we think is going to happen is often not what happens.
And I think I'm also hearing you say that the line between propositions and hypothesis may be blurring a bit.
Yep.
In that we're getting better at codifying or analyzing qualitative data, if I'm hearing you right.
Yes.
So that the future may be that when you get those managers to have input about why something is or isn't happening, or that you can codify that and use that as a variable. Yeah.
So here's the future fit vision, right? So you write up your logic model, you write your narrative, right? And I feed that into my generative AI model, and it pulls out all the things it needs to pull out: inputs, activities, outputs. It clarifies the proposition. It transforms them into hypotheses because it knows what data is required. And then humans now need to take over, right? Because humans need to say, these are the types of analyses that we need to run, and then the machine can do it. So some people are talking about what's called the fifth industrial revolution. You've heard that term? So the fourth is all about automation. The fifth is about collaborative intelligence. Humans working with machines. And so that's where the vision is that we can automate a lot of kind of the background work, but then the humans need to get engaged to help make decisions about types of analyses and what to do next.
Very cool. Do we have any questions? This is very exciting, in my opinion, in terms of where this stuff can be going, and hopefully, again, it hits the future fit theme that we're on perfectly, as it will segue into the next presentation, which would be kind of interesting. Any questions for Greg on this? Yeah.
Some of these large organizations, public or private, how do you go about addressing some of like the established management structures that are in place to actually align their data and analytics strategies, and whether that's cross-functional teams like you saw in the Crown or suggestions, what are some of the value propositions and approaches that you would take?
Yeah, it's a good point, because things get very entrenched, right? So normally, we start off by asking a series of simple questions. If you look at this logic model on the screen, for example, you can imagine that there are a whole bunch of different units involved, particularly in the activity box. And so with the senior leadership team, those are the types of questions that we asked. We asked specifically about decision rights. Who is empowered to make decisions when we finish this project? And then we hear all sorts of things. And sometimes they think about not necessarily restructuring, but getting the right people in the room. The large public sector organization, they had everybody in the room right off the bat. We left it with them after in terms of thinking about, do you need to restructure yourselves a little bit to make better use of this? The private sector organization, this is a humongous organization, they brought in the key section heads around the table, even people that they didn't think had anything to do with this. And again, we left it with them to figure out their decision rights and structures after. So to us, the analytic strategy is a catalyst for them thinking about how to work together around the data structures that they've created. One of my students did a project years ago where we asked the organization, what are the goals that you're trying to accomplish? And then we aligned those to the data sources, right? And it spanned the entire organization. And that drove them to think about, are we structured the right way given the series of goals that we have? So it becomes complicated. What we normally do is start with a fairly small project that's easily contained and demonstrate how that could work, and then allow them to think about, how do I spread this across the organization?
I think that scalability component is going to be really important as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
In other words, those are little models that you're going to be able to test further.
Yeah, it's always hard. We were starting with the sales organization and the large private sector company. But their intent was to drive it across the entire organization. We're talking about 120,000 employees. It's a big thing.
But it has implications in terms of the theory of discounting.
Yep.
To drive sales.
Yes.
That'll be much broader, won't it? In other words, by starting with those little models, you would generatively add to it over time, would you not?
Yeah, exactly.
And so for those of you in public sector, I mean, you've got a lot of theories of the program. Provide more information, people will do things, et cetera. And I'm hearing you say that by starting small, you generate a model that you can continuously update. So case studies are very useful in that regard.
Yeah, for sure. It's completely scalable, because if you think about the analytic strategy, right? Describe, association, model, scenario modeling. You can do that anywhere. You can do it at the top of the organization. You can do it in a small unit. So it's not meant to boil the ocean. It's meant to provide a starting point with some guidelines that say, when you start, include the decision makers at the very beginning. When you finish, ask the question, who has the authority to make changes based on the process you've just gone through? And then make those decisions. Once you've done that, celebrate. Tell everybody, right? We've had an impact. So one of my other students did a job at a small regional hospital. Interesting, because this was for the OR. We wanted to improve capacity in the operating room. And when she started, she realized that all of the data was in a thick book, handwritten. So she went through that thick book. She brought it all into an Excel spreadsheet and then moved forward to doing the assessment. We use a simulation model, a Monte Carlo simulation for that. And using that simulation model, by varying operating times and the number of surgeons and all that fun stuff, she got to a 38% increase in throughput in the OR. And then we left it with them, because it's up to management then to figure out what to do next. Well, what they did next was they continued the data gathering, but this time in digital format as opposed to on paper. And they continued with the simulation modeling that said, okay, every time I make a change here, I can see an impact over there. and now it's just part of how they do business, right? So that's how it works. Small project, prove results, and move forward. Yeah.
Which really does, again, keep in thinking with whether it's fifth generation or future fit
Yep.
performance measurement. I hope people are hearing this. This is away from the top-down superimposed indicators to something that's generative, learning, and continuously changing and evolving, and made for complexity. I mean, you mentioned it early.
Yeah.
We've tried to draw complexity in sometimes, overly so, but this one allows you to build into it through this sort of almost a fractal approach. You've got these small things you're building on, yeah?
Yeah, exactly.
Different approach to
Yeah,
complexity.
yeah. It just makes it easy, because when you try to boil the ocean, the change always fails, right? So.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, I know we're all going to keep moving through this. This was really, really exciting. I hope you appreciate this. And I know, Greg, you're a very generous person with sharing. There's lots of this available both online and
Yep.
and directly with you. So
Exactly, yep.
hope you'll join me in thanking Greg for what is a really thought-provoking, stimulating vision of the future.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are you sharing the slides?
I think we're sharing the slides, yes. I
Okay,
think everything will be available,
so
and we're videoing
My
this.
contact email is there. I've got a bunch of excited students who are really keen on working on these types of projects. So if you've got a project, you want a bunch of students. Good thing about students, they're pretty cheap. My heart, close your ears. Thank you all very much.
And I've worked
Okay.
with them. They're excellent. They do great work.
All
Thank
right,
you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Steve. Hi.
Stephanie's up next. She's got some video stuff, but it's kind of a nice segue, I think, right?
Oh yeah, excellent
Goes
segue.
from the analytical to the visual sort of component.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
okay, go okay from your point of view if I handle it the same way.
Oh,
I'll just sort
yeah.
of give you a very